operate in truth, right? Operate in truth. Tell the truth.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Gator Truth. On today's episode, we're going to be talking with Zach Morath from the Rebel Walk. He's going to tell us all about how the Rebels look coming into 2025. How are you doing today, Zach?
Good, man. It's Friday, finally the end of the week, but excited to talk about Rebel football.
Oh, definitely. And I've got to say, Florida has not played Mississippi too much over the last few decades, so it's always an interesting back and forth. And of course, upset last year in Gainesville, but potentially that could happen the opposite way in Hemingway this season coming up.
Yeah, that's kind of the hope, Daniel. I was actually back home for that game. I wasn't at school, thank God. I think vibes would have been even lower, but I was just kind of in disbelief. We went from dominating a really good Georgia team to having a bye week, which I thought, would potentially help us in Gainesville. And all the credit in the world to you guys, man. Just taking us by storm at that field and leaving really no questions answered. It was a great performance all around. So
Yeah. So, part of that coming in to kind of transition it, I know that you guys had high expectations, and part of that was having a very senior laden, some of that being transfers, you know, starting 22. How much are you transitioning this year? Like, how many starters are you replacing?
yeah, so it looks like we lost 8 players in the draft. So we're going to be led. It's very similar to Florida. We got Austin Simmons leading the way at 19 years old, one of the youngest players in the country. He reclassed from the 2025 class a couple of years ago. So he's been around in the Ole Miss system, and he's definitely leading the charge on offense. And then his main wide receiver is going to be Caden Lee, who actually is coming back from last year's team. He was phenomenal, kind of a leadership presence. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball. One of the big time factors which contributed to the success of last year was that defensive line. You lose Walter Nolan in the first round of the NFL draft, and then Prince Iman Mielen, JJ Pegues, all these different guys eventually get selected. Well, now you have a group of sophomores and juniors who haven't played a whole lot taken over there. And then I would say the weakest part of the team is definitely the secondary. We've had some trouble in past years, but I thought last year's secondary had Trey Amos, who was, I believe, a second-round pick. He kind of led the charge. So same situation, right? You're losing that veteran presence and making it up with a combination of young guys and transfers who haven't played a whole lot in the SEC. So I guess the big question is on offense and defense, how are these guys' talents going to translate? And how quickly do these young players develop and prepare themselves for the long haul of the SEC?
For sure. And starting on that offensive side, you brought up Austin Simmons, who of course flipped to Ole Miss from the Gators as he reclassified, got that in, and so in a way, this will be a fun matchup this year. You've got
Yeah.
DJ Lagway, who's going to be coming in the class after against the guy who kind of left UF with that
Right.
commitment of DJ Lagway. But what do you? I know you talked about the top receiver. What else do you have returning on that offense, and how much of it is new? So you talked about Caden Lee returning.
Yeah.
What about your offensive line? What do you see there?
Great question. Great question, Daniel. So, two offensive tackles are returning, fortunately, but they are very, injury prone. We went and got I'm trying to remember what school. I want to say Maryland or Rutgers, a big time transfer from one of those schools over there on the East Coast. So he'll probably start at one of those tackle spots. And then between center and the guards, it's that same combination of transfer players along with guys who've been developing and been in the system. But last year, a lot of the times when Jackson Dart had problems, it was because of that offensive line. So there's definitely some more pressure on the offensive line coach, John Garrison. That was a constant complaint from Ole Miss fans, I would say, from the first SEC game. So to be able to protect Austin Simmons and allow him to do his thing is going to be crucial. Running back room, similar situation. Wasn't great last year. It was one of the first times in Lane Kiffin's tenure at Ole Miss that his running backs weren't really effective. You look at past years, Zach Evans is now an NFL guy. He's been kind of working in and out there. Quinshon Judkins transferred to Ohio State, won a national championship. He's doing some not so great things right now, but we're not going to dive into that. But obviously this year, it's transfers and it's also freshmen coming up. And Logan Diggs, who was the former LSU wide receiver. A lot of people forget about Logan, LSU running back. He transfers to Ole Miss. He's recovering from an ACL injury, so he didn't play last year, but he's going to be back and ready to go. So it seems like I think depth is definitely a strength of Ole Miss. It's just figuring out which guys are you going to mix and match to get in that starting rotation, and who's next up if someone are to become injured.
Yeah, and of course, SEC being about that depth, it'll definitely be interesting. One thing that I can say is that no matter what the situation in the last 5 seasons at Ole Miss, somehow it seems Lane Kiffin has found a way to at least make it an exciting offense to watch. Maybe not as consistent at times in bigger games, but definitely exciting. And I've seen you guys compete with quite a few teams. It's been surprising. So punch your chance, right?
Yeah, and you've seen it, even a couple of years ago, we hosted Alabama, a game that we probably should have won. Jackson Dart has the ball at, I think, the 25, and we need a touchdown to win the game. It doesn't happen. But then I think, we kind of overcame that hump beating Georgia. But then at the same time, it doesn't feel like a whole lot because we travel to Gainesville and get embarrassed, quite honestly. That was a really tough loss. So I guess it's just transitioning from beating Georgia and using that approach to every football game, because I think Ole Miss should have, in my opinion, gone undefeated or maybe had one loss at LSU last year. So the mindset in terms of preparation has to be a little different. Obviously, the team's not as talented, but hopefully Lane and Pete Golding can do a nice job of getting this offense and defense prepared and ready to go. Because, again, you got road games at Georgia, Oklahoma, Mississippi State. You're hosting Florida and South Carolina. This is not okay. In terms of the SEC, I guess it's an easier schedule. But, you look across all the different conferences in the country, this is not a schedule which is going to be a fun one. That I'm trying to look at the road stretch. Yeah, it's UGA, Oklahoma, and then you have LSU. You're hosting them earlier in the season. So a lot of good competitive teams, as well as Tulane, who's a great G5 team led by John Summerall. They're going to come ready to go. I believe that's in week 4. So I'm happy that Ole Miss is having a little more competition, but they got to rise to the occasion a little bit better than they did last year.
Which kind of brings me to a point I was going to bring up and ask, and you've sort of answered it, but more specifically, we talk about last year and 9-3 being a disappointment because of everything you had. And you're kind of the hunter out or the hunted out there. Well, now you're transitioning quite a bit, and yet I still see some high expectations. How is that transition from being kind of the hunter or from the hunted to the hunter now, as you're expected by some to take a step back?
It's a good question, Daniel. And I think it propels our guys and gives them a little bit more momentum. Because let's be honest here, Ole Miss isn't a program that's used to having that amount of attention and the spotlight on them 24/7 like they did last year. And I think it's something they need to get accustomed to, because Lane Kiffin's proven he can get the talent on campus like he did last year. But going through that the first time, it's unique and you go through all these different challenges. I will say the one thing I'm excited about is instead of playing an SEC team in week 4 or 5, we are playing an SEC team in week 2. So you're not dilly-dallying with all these G5 teams and kicking their ass and not really knowing where you stand, because week 2, we're going to Lexington, which should be a win. But, they beat us last year. So you can't take that game for granted. So I think there's a lot of things that play into the mindset of Ole Miss in a positive direction. I'm just hoping they take advantage of it and come prepared, because in my opinion, if you're not undefeated, by the time the LSU game comes around, which includes wins over Kentucky, Arkansas, and Tulane, there's a problem. So coming out of the season, you got to be ready to go and hopefully come out hot before that hard stretch of SEC play comes around.
For sure. And I'm looking at your schedule now. I see after LSU, you've got a bye week, and then you've got Washington State at home, which is not the easiest out. And then, like you said, at Georgia, at Oklahoma, then you have South Carolina. Get a break with the Citadel, and then Florida is waiting at the end of that 6-game stretch. Do you think maybe that week against the Citadel will help Ole Miss, at least looking from right here before the season? Do you think it'll help kind of temper some of that 6-game stretch, or do you think that's still going to possibly have an impact going into the Florida game?
My hope is that Ole Miss uses the Citadel game to really start to recover some of the guys who are feeling beat up at that point in the season. I don't want to say it should be a bye week because it's not. You got to roll out your starters. They have to get reps on Saturday, especially in-game reps. But, for example, we talked about Caden Lee, one of our best wide receivers. Let's say, he's getting beat up and his hamstring's tight. That's a game where Caden Lee shouldn't play. He shouldn't even dress or warm up, in my opinion. So things like that, I think you can take into account. But at that point, we're going to be pretty close to figuring out where Ole Miss stands as well in terms of making the playoffs or not. And that Florida or South Carolina game, you're looking at maybe a college game day situation, and winner gets to the college football playoffs. So, all the stakes and all the attention are going to be focused on those two. I think regardless of the fact, because Florida and Carolina are probably going to be having decent seasons. So you got to be ready to go you got to be prepared to either go upset them or, play your way into the playoff spot.
Now, I've got to say, I love that despite massive turnover, you at Ole Miss, not just you, Zach, but it seems like Ole Miss still has the determination of we can go grab a playoff spot despite, turning over 15, 18 starting positions. I really, really love that mindset of not just, hey, we have an excuse for the year because it's transition.
Real quick, Daniel, I think part of that comes from watching exactly what happened last year, whether it was SMU, Indiana, Boise State. Obviously, a couple of them got automatic bids, but for the teams that didn't, it just kind of snuck in. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth watching them get absolutely demolished in the first round of the playoffs. So, I don't think there's any question that the playoffs needs more SEC teams, but definitely gives some hope looking at the competition that got to sneak in, fortunately, for last season.
For sure. Now, I also have to ask, what did you guys do to the SEC league office to get a stretch of 5 games to start, 6 games in after a bye, and then a bye week in the second to last week of the season before heading to Starkville to play the Bulldogs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Lane Kiffin is probably a guy who pulls some strings here and there. But I'm curious to see if that plays in our favor. We saw last year we had a bye week before Florida. We go to Gainesville and it doesn't even matter. So it's interesting. Definitely not looking forward to going to Mississippi State. I think obviously we have more talent and better coaching than them. I don't think that's much of a question right now, but it's always a trap game. It's a rivalry game. You understand how it goes with Florida State. So it's weird having that game last on the schedule. Hopefully the bye plays into our favor going into that week.
And why is this game being played at noon on Black Friday? I know it used to be played on Thanksgiving night, right?
Yeah, they moved it actually last year was the first time. I know I will not be making the trip. I really do not want to experience those cowbells in person. So
yeah, I experienced them last year. Granted, since they weren't having that great of a year and it was at the start of it, it wasn't as bad as I think it would be for an Egg Bowl where it's a rivalry game and people are showing up because they know it's the last time they can see the team of the season. With that said, I did have some blue cowbells that I went and, shook for my team.
As you should, man. That you got to battle it somehow.
Oh, we like to have fun. In fact, one of the extra ones I gave to listeners' sons. I was like, "Here, do this when we do well." He's formerly Army. He's probably listening to this. In fact, he may still be in, but transferred to Tampa. Although I think he got out and is in Tampa now. But he had been stationed in Mississippi for years, and so that was a game he could go to. So I went up to talk to him, and the package I got on Amazon had multiple cowbells, so I was just like, okay, here's one for the boys. Tell them to have a whole lot of fun with it.
That's amazing. I would have done the same thing. I can't lie.
Yeah. Oh man, but that 11 a.m. kickoff for a local kickoff for a rivalry game, that's just not right. So
Nothing worse, right?
yeah. Oh man. So with that said, what I guess summarize it up. What can you tell us going into 2025? What do you believe is the ceiling for this Rebel team?
Yeah, it's a good question, Daniel. I got the ceiling at 10-2. I got the floor at 8-4. So when you combine those two, I think the likelihood is 9-3. Don't know if it's enough to get you in the college football playoffs, but between hosting South Carolina, Florida, going to Georgia, going to Oklahoma, and then hosting LSU, I think, unfortunately, there's probably 2 losses in there. LSU's it reminds me of last year. They're gearing up just like Ole Miss did, dominated the transfer portal, got a really good high school class, and it seems like Brian Kelly's pretty dialed in with the amount of talent that he has. But it's going to be a fun one. I'm glad we get them at home. I'm very scared about the game in Athens because they're probably going to be a little irritated after what happened last year. So I think that's automatically 1 loss. And then you got to see what happens with obviously Florida, Carolina. You never know with Kentucky beat us last year. So the hope is 10-2. Realistically, I think it'll be 9-3. But there's definitely no question it can turn to 8-4 in the blink of an eye. So we'll see.
Definitely. And I decided to look at it just for fun ahead of your game against Georgia. And it looks like, you talked about buys and whatnot. This is what Georgia has coming into your game. And my listeners, one thing I talk about every preseason is what's the context of the game that we can see in the preseason, like who has what ahead of us.
Yeah.
Like last year, Ole Miss having a bye week before us. Georgia before you has Alabama, Kentucky, and then takes a trip to Auburn for their rivalry game and then host you. So maybe you might have that context luck of they've just had a tough, and before the bye week before Alabama, they go to Neyland Stadium. So maybe you might have a little bit of scheduling luck.
That is a gauntlet of a schedule. Wow. Yeah. Hopefully it plays to our favor now that you mention it. All right. Good signs. I like
it. Yeah. Hopefully. I mean, take anything we can get, right?
Right.
Of course, then they have a bye week after you and then face us in Jacksonville.
Of course.
So it is what it is, but we always have the bye week before Jacksonville, even in the years where there only is 1 bye week. So before we get out of here, Zach, where can listeners find you if they want to hear more of your opinions on Ole Miss football and anything SEC related?
Yeah, guys, first and foremost, huge shout out to Daniel and the channel for having us on. Really, really excited to join College Huddle and continue to communicate with you guys throughout the season. You can find the Rebel Walk Twitter at the Rebel Walk, Instagram at Rebel Walk. Same deal for Spotify, YouTube at the Rebel Walk. Feel free to subscribe, follow, leave a like. Follow my personal Twitter at Zach Mareth. It's my name, simply put. Reach out if you have any suggestions, anyone to interview, anything like that, any opinions, feel free. So again, Daniel, huge thanks to you for having me on. When you get up to Oxford, we're definitely going to have to connect at some point, and it's going to be a fun one, man.
Oh, definitely. And one more thing before we get out of here, since I didn't get to hook up with you last year before the game, for our Gator fans that know Ole Miss, just as another SEC team, maybe don't have full-on familiarity, what does hotty toddy mean? Can you share that with us?
Yeah. So it's a great question because there really isn't a fun story to it. There's a bunch of different people have all these different reasons as to why people, the saying started. So I honestly can't give you a straight answer on the background, but essentially it's a greeting, right? For Alabama, it's roll tide. For Ole Miss, if I see someone in a public spot, they're wearing Ole Miss stuff, hotty toddy man, go Rebs. That's all it is. It's kind of our saying. It's a fun one because there is that uncertainty of it, and it just sounds fun to say. So I enjoy it, man. And hopefully, I get a couple hotty toddies from some Gator fans when they're up in Oxford, enjoying themselves in the Grove.
For sure. And I can't wait to experience the Grove as we were talking about before we got on. My only experience up in Oxford was 2020, and we all know how the world was kind of shut down at the time, but
Yeah,
at least we had SEC football, right?
that's what I'm talking about.
Yep. All right. So, with that said, we'll go ahead and get out of here. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And as always,